Hello, thank you for watching. My name is Andy. This is the final part of this flipped preaching series on the book of Colossians. We're going to finish off the book here. So we're going to look today at the section between chapter 3:18 through to 4:18, which is the end. Now, this section starts with a really awkward bit of the Bible. It's sometimes called the household code, and it really jars with the rest of the book. The language is very different. I'm talking about the chunk here between 3:18 going up to 4:1. It's a very different style of language. It uses words which aren't used elsewhere in the book. It's as if this has been cut and pasted for someone else. If you were a teacher marking this as a piece of work, you'd have suspicions that they've copied. There's every chance that Paul has taken an existing piece of writing and stuck it in to this book. It really interrupts the flow. Some people think it might have been added later. But in any way, this chunk has slipped into the book somehow, and we need to unpick about why that may have been. It includes some verses which are really, really hard for us to stomach today. We've come a long way, and a lot of the things in here we just think, no, I don't think that's right. It says wives should subject themselves to their husbands. I don't know what you think about that, but there's no kind of clause saying what about if the husband is abusive. For a long time, verses like this have led to men being domineering over women, and has led to all sorts of unfairness and cruelty. It says slaves should obey their masters in all things. It condones slavery. It says that slavery is, if you're a slave, lump it, get on with it, do it well. And again, we have come on a long way, and we rightly reject all forms of slavery. So how do we deal with this chunk of the Bible? There are various ways of going about it. One is to say that Paul was just wrong. He wasn't Jesus. These were his sort of opinions. We just write them off as being a quirk of a strange man who no longer has any relevance for us today. That's one way to read it. Think that these verses are contradicted by everything we know about how God works. So therefore, don't skip over. Move on. don't pay too much attention to it. That's one way of reading it. And these are contradictory. I mean, even earlier in the book, in this letter, just a few verses earlier, he said that there are no slaves or free people. There are no Greeks or Jews, or he said that there is no difference between a free person and a slave. It's really liberating earlier on. In a similar book to Galatians, he said there's neither male nor female. Paul erases the difference between men and women. But here he seems to be saying that wives should be subservient to their husbands and slaves should obey their masters. I think you'll understand from reading the whole Bible that God is the God who frees slaves. The whole story started in Exodus with God freeing slaves from Egypt, making people, humans, in God's image. Not some better than others, we're all made in God's image. So that's one way to read it, is to think that this contradicts the broader view of God and humanity which we see in Scripture. Therefore, we just get rid of it. Another way is to think that Paul took an existing piece of writing and kind of undermined it. There are three types of people who are dealt with here. So we have wives, children, slaves. And in each of these three cases, there's a clause after it. So he says, wives, submit to your husbands. But then it says, husbands, love your wives. And the word love is the word agape, which means a self-sacrificial, self-giving love, epitomised by Jesus on the cross. When it talks about the slaves obeying their masters, it says that the masters need to recognise that they have a master in heaven, that they need to treat their slaves decently, and God is the God who frees slaves. So maybe Paul took this piece of writing, which originally was just about wives, children, slaves, and he's undermined it by adding on a bit saying, and this is what husbands, parents, slave masters have to do. So maybe he tried to undermine this writing. That's the second way of thinking about it. But it is tricky, and this is one of those cases where it shows the danger in taking a verse out of context. If you just take this, slaves obey your masters, that verse has been used through centuries to justify the keeping of slaves in terribly cruel conditions. And it took a while before Christians, John Wesley was a pioneer, I'm very proud to say, as a Methodist minister following his footsteps. John Wesley was one of the people who realised that actually slavery is against the Christian message, despite individual verses in the Bible saying so. So we can't take individual verses out of context, and where they contradict the broader view of what God is doing in the world. We can't take individual verses and hold them up saying this must be true. Anyway, we have this awkward bit. And then towards the end we get, as in all of Paul's letters, he ends up with a section of greetings where he says, give my greetings to various people, and various people with me send you their greetings. And there's one fascinating one which I want to just draw a bit of attention to. This happens in, let me find it, verse 15. It said, "Greet the brothers in Laodicea and Nympha and the house at her church." So Nympha was a lady. Firstly, this is a female person. This is a lady who owned a house and she ran a church in it. Right at the start, we have a lady running a church in her house, which is what all churches were in those days. They didn't have their own buildings. There was a female church leader right at the start, and Paul was completely on board with that, sent his greetings specifically to her. I think that's great. For a long time, sometime after this, the church changed its attitude to women church leaders, and it was seen as a male thing, that only men could be the people who lead churches. And that's persisted on, and only recently we've begun to undo some of that. Not in every denomination, but in Methodism we've made a bit of a head start towards that, which is brilliant, because right at the start there were female church leaders, and Nympha is often overlooked, but let's bring her story back. Okay, so the whole letter finishes with three simple words: grace with you. Grace, remember, means the goodness from God that we don't deserve. So may the goodness of God, the grace, be with you too. Bye bye.